Hello, all of you wonderful, sexy souls out there. Welcome back to the Sex, Drugs, and Jesus podcast. My name is De'Vannon Seráphino. This handsome stud sitting over here next to me, his name is Lucas Frederick William Wilson, but we will call him Lucas throughout this episode here. He is in Canada. That's why he has so many damn names, which I think is fucking awesome because you're only going to pass through this life once. And if you're not going to be extra about it, then why are you even bothering? Lucas, how are you?
Terrible. Thank you for asking. Next, but no, I'm very well. Thank you. I'm very glad to be here. Thank you so much for having me on.
Fuck yeah, yeah. Lucas is the editor and contributing author to a book that's coming out in January of 2025, January 21st, if I still have those dates correct. And it is called Shame, Sex, Attraction, Survivors, Stories of Conversion Therapy. Lucas is a victim of conversion therapy. I had a near miss with that when I was at Lakewood Church in Houston, Texas. These people have run wild with thinking they can tell other people how to live. A short little quick snippet on Lucas's bio, then we'll talk about the overture of this book. He's Dr. Lucas Wilson, by the way. He's a Justice, Equity, and Transformation postdoctoral fellow at University of Calgary. As a former evangelical and a survivor of conversion therapy, he is the editor of Shame, Sex, Attraction, Survivor Stories of Conversion Therapy. It's going to be published by JKP Books. There's a collection of short stories about conversion therapy written by conversion therapy survivors. Lucas's works have been in popular names that you know, like The Advocate and Queerty and LGBTQ Nation. Don't we love them for the filth that they provide, those publications, as well as the good information? They cater to all spectrums, and certainly they do not judge. But
Rick Raps. You're Rick Raps.
hey, there's a flavor for everything. So, putting all of these stories together, how many stories are going to be in the book?
So there are 17 chapters in total, plus an introduction, an afterword, and then a foreword by Gary Conley, who's the author of Boy Erased, and probably the most well-known conversion therapy survivor and author about his experience.
And also, y'all, Lucas's his Twitter information, his LinkedIn, and his website, uccalgary.academia.edu/Lucas Wilson, will all go in the show notes. Conversion therapy is a terrible fucking thing to go through. It's very difficult, and I know that it can be hard to get people to tell their story, and you got several people to do this. Talk to me about how gut-wrenching this was. I want to hear about the emotion that had to go into this, because when you write a book, you have to write it, then you got to go back and re-edit it, and so basically you're giving yourself exposure therapy and re-ripping those wounds over time and time again. You're also healing them at the same time. What did you experience in dealing with all of these different authors?
Yeah, and I think the first part of my response would be the fact that so many stories that I would have loved to have included just weren't even offered because so many people don't have the emotional capacity, the desire, sort of wherewithal to even write these stories. So many folks who underwent conversion therapy don't even come to approach their story because it's in a lot of ways the terms to put to paper. And I think that that's the crazy thing about so many of these experiences of queer oppression that, not just within conversion therapy and beyond, but also beyond, that you have so many people who have undergone so many things who will never know those stories. So first of all, these are just the stories that were told. And there are so many that will forever be, or perhaps at least right now, be untold. And so actually coming to the stories when they were submitted, there were more stories were submitted than were included. And there's this whole sort of editorial process that you kind of go through and talk to have an editor on top of me. And so we're talking with them about, which stories to include and which ones not to include. But the one thing I included, and when I decided, okay, these are the stories that will be part of the collection, it was very difficult. I mean, a number of, especially if you were saying that editing and that re-editing process that, for some of the stories, it was maybe the second or third attempt, and that was, the story was quote unquote done and ready for the editor to see them. Other stories, it took more, right? It took more editing and drafting of the document of the stories themselves. in order to get them to a place that was publishable. And so that process, for some people, it was difficult for them in the sense that, these are their stories, these are their words. And of course, anything we write, anything we put forward into the world is personal. And when you do that and someone comes along like me, who for a lot of these folks was a complete stranger, editing their work, they thought, well, who are you to say the story you to edit this and, change my story? But of course, it's this very sensitive, delicate dance or balance that you have to sort of strike when you're going through other people's work. And of course, to be incredibly sensitive to people's, not just their stories, but also their emotions and their feelings and their responses, because they're all valid, obviously. And so that was difficult. But thinking about the content of these stories when I was reading them, when it was just me and my computer, reading these stories, it was it was tough because you have things that you just forget. There was one author, and I was reading him this story, and he was talking about the sort of mental gymnastics that he had to perform when showering. And what I mean to that is that within, evangelicalism and, within Christian right more broadly, and also more specifically within, conversion therapy context, what we're told is that, the showering is this moment of, how do you say, of possible temptation, right? That you're in the stall, you're naked, and you have to touch yourself, and touching yourself might arouse you. And then, for most people, they wouldn't even think twice about that. But for Christians, and for those specifically who are going through conversion therapy, they're taught to really steer their body in a lot of ways, right? That this is a moment of potential, of opening yourself up to the enemy, to the devil, and to Satan potentially. And when reading this story about again, sort of anxiety about just showering, doing something as commonplace and mundane as showering, it brought me back to when I was in this headspace, when I was undergoing conversion therapy and beyond. Because conversion therapy doesn't just end once you finish meeting with a person or people or a group or a temple, whichever. It goes well beyond that. And the enduring consequences of conversion therapy oftentimes are felt and experienced much later on. So nonetheless, reading this man's story, I was taken aback, and I was taken back to the time when I was in this headspace. And it's rough because you do your best to forget a lot of it. You do your best to move on, sort of come to terms with it. But I think that when you have these moments that you, in some ways, either forgotten unintentionally or willfully blocked out of your mind, and then get reanimated for you by reading a story like these stories that I was reading, it's tough. It's not easy, and it was an emotional process throughout. And so reading that story as well as the other stories, and again, some stories that were super similar to my experience and others that were so far from my experience. Nonetheless, I think reading these stories, what it really brought up, really how broad a category that, conversion therapy or conversion practices, which is really the language that a lot of people use nowadays. I just use conversion therapy because it's more recognizable by a general public, but conversion practices, how broad these practices really are across faith traditions, across time, across, it's not just sitting in, a room with quote unquote counselor. It can also be with parents. It can also be by yourself. It can also be online. There are so many different expressions of conversion practices or moments or instances of conversion practices that when I was reading these stories, that really was one of the main things that I took away, was how many people have undergone these conversion practices. And in some cases, didn't know it until many years later.
Well, so that sounds like therapy to me, which is what books are. Like, one of the surprising things is being an author myself now 2 times over, you just get healed in the process, and it's also the same thing with being a podcast host. Taking time to deal with other people's stories heals them. It helps to heal you by dealing with other people's stories, 'cause that's the way energy flows. Giving enough of a damn to help somebody like that, that's very good karma that you have set aside for yourself, young Luke. And I want you to read your 2-page, roughly 4-minute personal conversion therapy. So, y'all, Lucas is about to read for us his personal conversion therapy story. And so just get comfortable, because it's going to be a couple of minutes, but it's going to be so worth it because you need to know the flavor and tone of this book and where we're coming from and why we think it's so important. Lucas, take us away.
So I should give a little preface, if that's okay, just that if this is a story that's around, I think in the actual text, I think it's like 11 pages. Right. So this is just the quick beginning of it. There's a lot more to it. It's divided into two. This is only part of the first section. And this will give you a little bit of an idea of how I go about talking about my conversion therapy experience. And I do oftentimes use humor to talk about my experience. A lot of people don't. Some people do. Obviously, it's, individual to the individual or specific to the individual. And so this is how I start my story. My story, and again, I hope that you'll hear some of the humor in it. And I think humor is, again, one way of sort of negotiating or navigating, working through this, how do you say, in the academic sort of, these bullshit. And so the story is entitled Engagement and Sea Dating. And this is about my experience in group conversion therapy at Liberty University. So here we go. Enough for the practice. Just get into it. Here we go. What do you think the guys in the group are going to be like? I asked as I pushed my safe forward and took the last bite of my supper. I'm honestly so curious to find out, Thad said, his eyes glinting. He sat back in his chair and lifted his veiny arms behind his head. His dark armpit hair peeked out from under his t-shirt. I couldn't stop staring. Would you bring deodorant? I wondered. All I wanted to do was stick my nose in his ears, inhale, and inhale deeply. Thad and I were sitting in Liberty's cafeteria. Liberty University, the evangelical college that touted itself as the world's most exciting university, was where we had both chosen to study. And like our peers, we wanted to receive a Christian education in order to, upon graduation, set the world on fire for Jesus. It was the second or third time Thad and I had hung it. We had met when Steph, the gal I was half-heartedly trying to pursue at the time, suggested he and I could. When I told Steph that I was more attracted to guys than women, to my surprise, she didn't hide tailing. Instead, she thought I could speak with her friend Thad, someone who also struggled with same-sex attraction and who, she said, could potentially help me figure out my desire for men. When she had first told me about him, I secretly hoped he would be handsome. Even though I believed I wanted to become straight, not to mention sexually pure, my hormones were nonetheless raging. So when Thad and I eventually met up, I was delighted to find out that he was, in fact, a major babe. Thad was one of the few guys like me I knew personally on campus. With the exception of one friend I'd met early on in my time at Liberty, there were only a couple of others I'd had known who also dealt with same-sex attraction. One was my spiritual life director in my freshman dorm, with whom I had an incredibly bizarre one-night stand and who stopped talking to me immediately thereafter. It was because of my short trip with my spiritual life director that I initially went to meet with Pastor Dane Emmerich, the man on campus who promised to help male students who were struggling with same-sex attraction, and the man who was leading the group Thad and I were to attend that evening. At the time I hooked up with my spiritual life director, I felt that I had no one else to speak with at a university that fined, punished, and even expelled students for acting on their same-sex attractions. So when Steph introduced Thad and me, I was relieved to meet someone else who shared my struggle. But the flesh was weak, and I could only hope that it was for him too. Thad, however, was in no way interested. He talked to me as if I were his younger brother. Even though I was always down for some good old-fashioned role play, it was clear that Thad was not, at least not with me. And I'll leave it there.
I have the horror stories I've heard coming out of Christian universities are on par with the horror stories coming out of churches. It's the same oppressive energy and spirits that prevail over both, and then that trickles down into the staff, and they pick staff that are going to reinforce that, and then it trickles down into the students, and because the energy is there, it's so prevalent and it's difficult to detect because it's everywhere. And then when we see the same energy everywhere in our subconscious, it tends to validate it, even though it's not. How did you how were you able to, I guess, undo or get healed from the conversion, from the conversion therapy energy or process?
So for me, I went straight from Liberty University, which again, I briefly introduced in the story, but it's the world's largest evangelical university located in Lynchburg, Virginia. There's more to say about that, and we'll put that aside for now. And I did there, and there, I did my conversion therapy for 4 years. Group experience that I detail in that story. And we don't even get to the group experience. We're still sitting in the cafeteria by the time I, ended that. But I go into detail about what it was like to go into the group and how bizarre it was. Then the consequences going to that group and specifically someone I met in the group. But I'm putting it aside. I was in conversion therapy for 4 years in one-on-one meetings with the man, Mr. Dane Emmerich, who was the in-house conversion therapist on campus. And so for me, I graduated from Liberty in 2012, and then I was in grad school for 3 years, and then I took a year off and I taught for a year, and then resumed my graduate studies after that for 6 years, and then have been in research since. And so with that being said, I really and honestly believe that what saved me and what allowed me to work through a lot of what happened to me was by way of academic study. And the beautiful thing for me is that it wasn't just academic study, it was also I entered into divinity school, which was very much this academic approach to spirituality. And for me, I was able to take a number of courses that were not just academic or, appealing to the mind, but they were also appealing to the heart. They were allowing me to work through more personal and private matters while also approaching these topics by way of scholarship. And so for me, I think that it was really thinking deeply about a lot of these topics and then feeling deeply about a lot of these topics, give me that time and that space to approach what happened to me in a very concentrated and thoughtful and also mindful, maybe demure, I don't know, maybe not demure, sort of approach to these topics. And so I think that was really my saving grace. And then, of course, also going to therapy on top of that for a while. I think compounded what I would like to think is the healing process of working through and coming to terms what happened to me in conversion therapy.
Were you ever I was snickering while you were talking for a moment because as you were talking, it dawned on me that this is Jerry Falwell's fucking school. And then I wanted to go over to Google and look up something real quick, which I'm going to talk about. I was like, wait a minute, it's ringing a bell over here. And so you it's a whole ass other can of worms. Were you ever suicidal? Did you ever do any self-harm?
I never did, thankfully. Because, I've never, how do I say this? Mental health issues run deep in my family. However, I've never felt like I've struggled with mental health issues. Of course, maybe, that might sound bizarre to just talk about the consequences and the negative effects of conversion therapy, but that's not what happened to me in conversion therapy didn't affect me to such a level that I developed, clinical depression or clinical anxiety or anything like that. There were negative, and I mean really negative consequences like shame, like anxiety, like, guilt, self-hatred, this kind of stuff. But that I do not and probably never will constitute, at least in my estimation, mental health issues, which, I think oftentimes the students of these mental health issues are, self-harm and suicidal ideation. And I've never struggled with that. I've always been able to sort of handle what happened to me in a way that didn't lead me to feel like I wanted to take my life or that I wanted to hurt myself. And I think really largely the reason for that is the support system that I've had inside of the church. I don't come from a Christian family. My siblings are we were all raised in a Christian home that we went to church every so often. They especially went to church. I'm the youngest of five. And if you can see here, this is the Wilson family. Here in the back of my cell phone, I'm showing. And I'm very close to my siblings. I wasn't always, and when I was in conversion therapy, I was not close to my siblings per se. Maybe my sister, but not so much my brothers. But in the years after it, when I really did start working through it, is when I really latched onto my family as a support system. And I've been really, really lucky to have them. Also just having good pals, outside the church. A few who are still within the church, they're more Christians, and but nonetheless, my sexuality isn't an issue for them, for which I'm, again, quite grateful. It's kind of a baseline thing that they don't have an issue with me, but nonetheless, they don't. And we're for those folks. I think because of the support systems I've had, I'm not struggling with the two issues that you named.
Any addictions? And if not you, then anybody in the book. Is there any self-harm? Do we have any addictions going on?
Yeah, there are a number of folks who struggle with suicidal ideation. There are a number of folks who talk about mental health issues, whether that be addiction or perhaps other, forms of, or yeah, other issues. I think that what we find with a lot of people is that there are a lot of commonalities. And again, like because the title theme same sex attraction, the number one fight consequence of conversion therapy, but also the number one thing that brings people into conversion therapy is shame. So there are a lot of things that are psychological, emotional, spiritual, some might say, consequences. And you do see that play out in a number of ways, like you said, with addiction, with other problems. And I think the beautiful thing about the collection, though, is that a lot of the people who are included, probably all who are included, have really found a place in their lives where they are doing really well for themselves. However, what I actually explicitly was looking for was for people to write stories that didn't necessarily end with that ribbon on the end, right? Where everything's fine, everything's good, all is well and good with our throne. No, I didn't want that. I wanted people to write stories that left readers with a sense of what it was like to be in conversion therapy. Of course, no one's ever going to know what it's like unless you're in it. But I wanted their stories to end in a place, not where everything's tied together and again, there's some sort of narrative resolution, but instead to sit with the discomfort. What was it like for those of us who went through it? And to sit there and say, like, yes, the story ends here. And obviously the person who wrote it is most likely, in a better place now. But I didn't want to give them that sort of, the word, that gift in a way. I wanted people to stay with stories that really left them in the space that these people were left once they finished conversion therapy. And also, the space that they continued to occupy years after.
Very good. Speak about the overall flavor of where people are now. Are they still in church? Are they like, fuck God, don't want anything to do with that? Have they become atheists? Are they like dominatrices now? Like what?
Wish I could report that they were all, in the BDSM community. However, I don't know if that'd be accurate, but I actually don't know what a lot of these folks do behind closed doors, but I haven't asked, but who knows? What I will say is that a lot of these people are doing really well. I can think of a few. You are really fabulous advocates with your community. I think they've got Jordan Sullivan, who does a lot of phenomenal work in Canada as it relates to conversion therapy specifically. I can think of Jen Uki and their work, they do across Canada and internationally when it comes to conversion therapy and queer rights and queer issues. I can think of other folks who, this is their first time really writing about their experiences and they are, working in their home state if you're from the US, doing their thing. And then I can figure people who moved to other cities because of where they were from, whether it be in the South or the Midwest, that they moved to bigger cities and gone on to better things. And so I think the overall sort of place that a lot of these people have ended is in a much better place than where they started, right? And for which we're very thankful. I think that people, a lot of the folks in this collection have, they've survived and now they thrive. And for a number of reasons. And I think that, again, it goes back to finding solid queer community, which actually the research behind conversion practices and those who've undergone it really supports that one of the best ways for survivors of conversion therapy to thrive is to find a community, especially a queer community, but also not only queer communities, but others, who are supportive and who listen and allowed for them to have the space to talk about this and to think about this. And I think that the book, the collection itself, Same-Sex Attraction, I think this is hopefully one more outlet for these folks, their voices to be heard.
Very, very good. And you personally, do you still attend church? Or where are you at with the big guy upstairs now?
I just realized I totally didn't answer part of your question, which was like the spiritual aspect. I'm so sorry. Where do they land spiritually? Was that not the question? Geez, love, reason. Okay. I agree. For the soul there. Damn thing. Oh my gosh. From my understanding, I'm so sorry. I went off in a totally different direction. From my understanding, a lot of the folks are not religious. I don't think that is the case for everybody. I think some of the contributors have some semblance of a relationship to God, whether it be more private and confessional rather than public and communal. I don't really know, but my sort of, what's the word? Uh, my empathy is that a lot of people who've left the church. I think three stories were not for Christian backgrounds. One was with an Orthodox Jewish background, one was from a secular background, and one was from the awkward described as a cult. So those three folks, I think all three of them are non-religious. But for those who come from the evangelical and white Christian fundamentalist and charismatic backgrounds, most I understand are not out of those faith traditions. But again, I don't want to speak for anyone because I don't, you know, I can't say completely confidently that all right. As for me, I am no longer a person of faith. I was for a long time. I was until about, goodness, maybe age 26, 27, in and around there. But for me, it wasn't so much my sexuality that pushed me from the church and from my faith. It was more so what I've researched up until this point largely has been intergenerational trauma as it relates specifically to Holocaust survivors, their children and their grandchildren. And so for me, researching the Holocaust was, of course, in order to research, the intergenerational trauma, you have to understand what happened. And so for me, a lot of my past research study was in the Holocaust. Definitely also what led up to the Holocaust. And for me, it was really researching those topics that pushed me out of my faith. And I think a lot of people will talk about, how sad that is, or that I must miss it, or that I must have traded it in for something else. And I don't really think I do miss it. And I truly don't think I've traded it in for anything. Like I've given up one orthodoxy and embraced another. I don't think that's been my experience. For me, it's been more so that I don't miss those things. I don't miss God. I don't miss the community because I found a really phenomenal community. Maybe that is mutually again in one community for another. I don't know. I don't really miss God. I thought I would, and I did for a long time, but at this point, I sincerely don't. Um, I don't really feel like I have a need for a spiritual sort of aspect to my life. And maybe also what I could say is that maybe what I define as spiritual or not spiritual is different from how a lot of other folks would. For me, it's very much more social, it's very much more communal. I put a lot of investment and time into my relationships with, friends, families, right? Friends, family, and loved ones, this kind of stuff. And I just don't miss it. I did for a long time, but I don't anymore.
I wonder though if you ever really like for real knew God in the first place though. Because the thing is, church, like those people you were saying now have like more like their private thing at home with God. That's a more pure form of religion than going to church. Because church is not it's like our relationship with God is like any other relationship. Going out on dates and being in public with whoever our significant other or others are is not nearly as intimate as when we're alone. So church is not it's not about being close with God. It's not. And so many people spend a lot of time in church and many years and don't ever really know God. And they know the experience of worship, the state of hypersuggestibility that happens when people go into churches, which is overstimulation for the sake of influence, being able to influence people. They know what preachers say about God. They know things like that, but that is not the same as getting to know God quiet, alone, away from other people's opinions, away from what other people have to say, away from other people's interpretation of the Bible, away from the community. That's the only time somebody can actually know the real God. And so my question would be to you and then anybody else who has some like I don't fuck with God thing, like, the the origin question is, did you know him in the first place? And then if you really, really knew him, how? Based on what? And if the only responses are, well, you went to church or you did the 7 prayers or you went to catechism or the Hail Marys or all the saints' names, all of those things have whatever their place is, but that ain't God. So and
Mhm.
so just think about that. And,
Yeah. I would say, so for me, I wasn't actually raised in the church. Again, we went to church when I was little, up until about like, I don't know, like grade 3. But for me, that it wasn't um, sort of like a family thing that I held on to, and that wasn't really my entrance into the church, because it was in grade 9 that got really into like the creation versus evolution debate. I mean, and was really invested. And so, started thinking, well, if in fact I believe there's a creator, who is this creator? Maybe it's that God that, I went to worship on Sundays when I was a kid. So I went back to the church that I went to when I was a kid. And within, I don't know, 4-ish months, I think that was the time that I really, in my mind, met Jesus. And it was very personal. I mean, there was obviously like the community surrounding me and a lot of people and factors shaping my faith. But for me, it was super personal. It was super one-on-one, and it wasn't a chore to read my Bible. I actually loved it. It wasn't a chore to pray or to watch sermons online or blah blah blah, or when I'd go to church, all that kind of stuff. And but for me, it was like so exciting because I felt like I was connecting with this part of the universe and the creator of the universe I theretofore did not know, and it felt so electric. And I was considered in my youth group sort of like a small evangelist. Like I went around my high school. I went to Rosedale Heights School of the Arts, like so gay, but apparently it was, so strict. Not at all. I think everyone knew, open secret, whatever. But nonetheless, I, was at Rosedale Heights School of the Arts telling all my friends, you got to come to church with me. You got to come to church with me. And they're all like, what the hell is this? I'm like, who's this kid? And so it was not just personally excited about God, but I wanted other people to know the same excitement that I had. And for me, it was super important that I told people about God. And, I remember I had a high school teacher. I came up with years later, and he said, Luke, I think I said to him, I was like, oh man, I was, a dink in high school. And he goes, no, yeah, you were an asshole, but you were such a sweet asshole. He was like, you had these horrible beliefs, but you can't in such a nice way. And I thought about that, like for me, it was like I wanted all my friends and I wanted all my teachers and everyone around me to know the same thing that I knew. And for me, it felt so real. It felt more real, I think, than a lot of other things in my life, including even my sexuality, right? Like I thought God's more real than me being gay. And of course, some people might say, well, wait a second, that sounds like a bad God to me. And I think for me, that pulling on that string of the bad God and saying, okay, well, who is this God? What's the character of this God? And that's where I go all the way, I think, fast forward all the way to when I was, in grad school. And I was sitting there on my couch. And at this point, I don't know, I didn't really know what I thought. It was like, well, God feels so distant at this point. I just don't know the God that I believed in for so long really is the God that I believe in now. And I was sitting there, I was reading this one author, Elie Wiesel, earlier. It's actually a Nobel Prize, well, recipient, survivor of Holocaust, survivor of several concentration camps, including Auschwitz. I was reading his work, and I was sitting there, and I was like, all of a sudden, and I was reading his work when I was a little cool, on whatever, like Instagram or whatever, and I saw someone had posted this little, whatever, stupid story, and it said along the lines of that they were blessed because God had given them free Starbucks, coffee. And I'm sitting there and I'm thinking to myself, wait, this person is saying that they're blessed because God gave them a free Starbucks coffee. Okay. I find that incredibly bizarre that God took time out of God's day to, give this person a free Starbucks coffee. Down the road, or perhaps sitting right outside, Starbucks would have most likely been a person who was experiencing homelessness. And the fact that God apparently, in this woman's imagination, had given her a coffee, but not the person who was sitting there, that to me, I was like, wait a second. Do I believe in a God that would do that? Do I believe that God's out there getting free Starbucks coffees to people who don't need them and yet withholding those from others? Because if we do believe that gifts are given from God, those are free gifts. And those are willful actions on God's side, right? Like God has chosen to give whoever, a coffee. That's a decision on God's part. But that would therefore presuppose that whoever is not getting a coffee is, that God is withholding the coffee. And that's also a willful decision. So God's choosing in one moment to give coffee here, but not choosing in this moment to give someone who needs coffee even more, and a lot more than just a coffee, nothing. And I was like, dear Lord, is that real? Is that the God that I believe in? That God is a giver of good gifts, but yet withhold gifts from those who deserve them and need them more? And that for me was, and then I connected it to the Holocaust. I started thinking about theodicy and questions of evil and reconciling. How do I say that God is good, but God didn't do X, Y, and Z during the Holocaust, during this moment here, or pick your moment in history. And that for me was where I started questioning the goodness and the character of God in a way that I hadn't really before. And maybe these are questions I should have considered long time before this. However, this was my journey, and this was when it sort of came up for me all in this moment while reading about the Holocaust and reading this, Instagram, whatever sort of post. It all came together in such a way that I thought to myself, well, I just don't think that God acts, or that if God does act, then God's not good. And that for me was a really difficult moment that really imploded my faith, or exploded my faith. I don't know, whatever the next word is. And I think for me, it wasn't that I didn't believe in God or didn't know God. In fact, I felt so often that God was my closest ally for so long. I think it was just that when I actually realized that I don't believe that there is a being out there who does or is what I thought that being did or was, that I just couldn't for me reconcile that with believing in God anymore in the way that I did. I'm not saying that doesn't exist. I actually think God does exist. And he or what God is, but and I think God cares about who or what I am, but I do believe that there's something I still don't know if I can ever name it and therefore claim it.
I hear you on that. I would caution this, and this is to the rest of you out there in the world too. And I was actually just speaking about this on one of my solo episodes. Be careful with how the mind works, because we have a lot of subtle constructs that we set up in our mind, and sometimes we have things that are working against us and we can't really see how. So whenever I hear somebody speak along this train of energy here, what I'm hearing you say is you've assessed something according to your point of view, and you don't like what God did. But that's in effect saying you think that you know better, or you would have done it a different way. And then the thing about approaching a divine being is that we don't. And that's the whole point of it all. So we have to have like a large degree of humility, and we can't let hubris or pride, which can sneak in very subtly in our emotionalism and us wanting to be good humans and good humanitarians, creep up in us and present as something beneficial to us, when really that hubris can take our feet out from under us, but it will present as the wanting to be kind and open-hearted and caring to people, but it's going to snatch a relationship with the divine away, because in that moment, your hubris posed as benevolence is going to put you in a position of exalting yourself above God, and it's going to make you feel like you're doing good because you're going forth in this righteous vengeance. But at the end of the day, God is above and we're below, which is a beautiful thing. Now, your example of the woman at Starbucks who could be feeding a coffee addiction that's ruining her marriage, and we don't know that. And the homeless person outside who might have a caffeine sensitivity, and we don't know that. Or they could be homeless by choice. I've been homeless now twice. I know the stories of why people end up out there. Not everybody is unhappy or miserable. Some of them have chosen that because it's giving them fucking peace relative to the life they used to have. So what God has that we do not is a full 360 view in past, present, and future. And so we must be careful when we get onto these tangents of why didn't God do what we think he should have done, and just monitor our emotions and really be sure that because anytime we come from heightened or spiked emotions, it's usually not going to render any sort of logic or reason. We have to stay calm and really look at it very objectively and to be sure that we're not projecting like ourselves into it or pain or anything like that, so that we don't let let our hubris come up like that. People do this even not referring to God, they'll do referring to other people that I would have done that way. Why didn't they do it? Republicans do that shit all the time. Like why don't they act like I act? Why didn't they do what I would have done? I know best here. Look at what's happening. Look at what's happening. We don't really like we know as far as we know, as far as our life experiences, but we don't know. A part of our whole path is to learn ourselves the best we can. So we damn sure don't know that much about other people's dynamics or what should have happened. We just don't. And when we let go of that, then we can accept, the fact that God does love us, and we can let that rage and that anger and that bitterness go, because it's hurting us, it's not really serving us, even though it feels like strength and something righteous to do in the moment. It's very subtle. It's a very strong trick of the evil out there to play that upon people.
Are you calling me a Republican?
Now, I'd rather call you, but
Don't you dare. I hear what you're saying. I hear what you're saying. And I think for me, like, it wasn't so much like an emotional, it actually, there's this one line, and it's one of the most sort of haunting lines in literature, and I can't even remember it. But it's really that haunting that I can't remember at this point, but it says like, the universe doesn't end with like a bang, it ends with a whimper. And for me, like, my faith didn't end with a bang. Like, it wasn't this emotional sort of like, oh, fuck you. It was more so just this whimper. It was kind of like, oh, that's that. And I think for me, I don't know, and I hear what you're saying, like, not to have a certain level of hubris or thinking I'm better than God. But I do think to myself, like, if you've ever seen the film Trial, it's this film, again, not to bring it back to the Holocaust, but it's this BBC film that was put forward, and it's these inmates in Auschwitz, I believe, and they're putting God on trial. And I just think to myself, like, if anyone has to give me a call for so much, it's God. And again, and this sounds like who am I to say this as a human? But and then, oftentimes there's the verse that's thrown around, God's ways are higher than mine. But I find that to be somewhat of a cop out. Like, I was listening to a debate a few days ago. It was with these two, I guess, atheist agnostics, maybe more better agnostics, speaking to this evangelical guy, and they were talking to him about slavery, and that, how in the world through the Bible, in the Hebrew Bible, what many call the Old Testament, how could God allow for slavery? And then later on, we see, of course, for slavery, like, apparently, in the New Testament, there's actually a lot of justification for slavery, or quote unquote justification, way the New Testament supports slavery. But of course, what we found with abolitionists was that they used the Bible to support anti-abolition sort of efforts, and that they wanted to end slavery by using the Bible. So you can see it both ways. But for me, it was just like, how in the world could God have changed God's mind and then, allowing for people to be enslaved? And then later on, apparently it's no longer what God wants. And I'm thinking to myself, well, what Scripture says, and if in fact we are to take Scripture as so that gives voice to who God is, they can't square that away. And again, maybe God's ways are harder than mine. Maybe I am being hubristic, and I think that I'm better than I am. Trust me, I don't think I'm that great. I know where I sit in the world of things, but for this specifically, I don't think it's me who has to give an account. I think it's God. But again, who am I? And I don't mean to step on any toes, but I do think that God has a lot to explain. If in fact God is who I think God is, or was.
Well, when you can. Well, you won't ever hear any of his explanations if you don't talk to him. So maybe drop him a line from time to time and just go to him and pour out your heart and just be like, Lord, this is how I feel, but I'm open to what you have to say, because maybe I don't know. And just be honest about it.
And I think that epistemic humility is important, because that's why I'm not an atheist. I don't say that this is the case. This is just simply, I leave room open for God, and I leave room open for a lot of things. And I hope you know, I can think of other things too, but I just think to myself, like, at the end of the day, right now, the evidence and the vibes, if we're to use sort of a Gen Z sort of uh, word or phrase, it just doesn't lead me there. And again, maybe one day I'll change my mind. Maybe one day I'll have a coming to Jesus moment. Um, but for right now, I don't think that's where I see God. Or if I see God, I see something. I just don't know what the heck it is.
Well, all things in its time. Let's turn it to the book cover, and I will put this up on the screen whenever I go back to edit this. So on this book cover, and we see your beautiful name there, Lucas F.W. Wilson. If that's not an author's name, then what the fuck is? We see this author, for those of you who may be listening and not watching on YouTube. It's a picture of a person like crying and holding their face in their hand, and it's made with it's a black background, and the squiggly lines, it's like this body, it's like just from the trunk up, like from the waist up, made of like squiggly beige, kind of like a dark cream, earth tone kind of color, and all of the words are in the kind of like a lighter version of that. When you see this cover, Lucas, what does it resonate for you? And how does it apply to what the book's theme is?
So I'm gonna pull it up myself because I haven't looked at it in a hot minute. So, I mean, when I think about, again, the title is called Shame, Sex, Attraction, which is a play on what a lot of, folks within conversion therapy circles refer to as same sex attraction. So a lot of people within these circles say, no one's gay or queer. They just struggle with same sex attraction, which is a way of divorcing one's orientation or desires, they'd be more accurately, one's desires for who they really are. Like everyone's a latent or possible heterosexual. It's just that they struggle with this thing that affects them, i.e. same-sex attraction. And so I played with that same-sex attraction because, again, not only is shame cited commonly as the number one consequence of conversion therapy, but it's also what brings people into conversion therapy. If they didn't feel ashamed of themselves, most likely they wouldn't be in conversion therapy. And so shame, when I think about shame, and I promise I'm getting to the cover, I promise I'm going to connect it to something. Okay, but with shame, shame and guilt are two different things, right? Guilt, if you think about it in the court of law, I might be guilty for, I don't know, stealing an ice cream cone. I stole the ice cream cone, and for that specific action, I'm guilty. That doesn't mean that I as a person am bad and that I'm guilty for everything. No, I'm just guilty for that one specific transgression or action. Shame, on the other hand, is where one doesn't just feel like one thing that one did or one part of oneself is bad, if the person themselves is bad, right? That they as a person are bad. And then you feel that sort of self, negation or self-hatred for the fact that you as a person are ashamed if you are not for what you've done in one specific moment, but for who you are, now and for the past and potentially even the future. So shame is really, it's also something that's not just a feeling about yourself. It's always already a social emotion in the sense that I don't feel ashamed for things that I've done unless there's a person who looks at me and sees me for, who I think I am or who they think I am, which is or negative or, uh, damaged. And so it's a social emotion, right? In a different way that you might have anxiety, but that doesn't mean that there's necessarily a person that's making you feel that way. Shame is something that you feel because of the gaze of another, because of how they look at you, because of how they see you. So on the cover, when you see this person with humor or his or her, face, and let's just use the gender neutral, their face, they're covering their face because really where shame most viscerally registers on a person is their face, right? Their eyes specifically, that people don't want when they feel ashamed for others to look at them. They don't want people to see them. And of course, windows being the eyes of the soul, whatever sort of cliche we want to use, that if that's the case, people will cover their face. And so what you see on the cover is this person covering their face, and they're covering their face because they feel ashamed. And really, perhaps in my estimation, best register of shame or the best a way of sealing it, if we can see it on the body and written into or onto your body, it's really when someone covers their face, particularly their eyes, so others can't see them. And so the cover that we have for the book is exactly that. And I think it gives voice, or in this case, gives image to, you know, experience of conversion therapy, specifically the experience of shame.
Yeah, that is one good way to look at it. If they're not crying, then they do look like they're ashamed. Hmm. Well,
What do you think?
I said, well, fuck that. We don't. Shame is only like beneficial if we actually, like, I think, correct ourselves. Like, say we've been, like we were talking about before the show come on, like, say we've been being a hoe. Not that Lucas and I have been being hoes. We're talking about other hoes. Like, I was telling him like how there's a lot of young, hot ass dudes who I'm meeting now who are not sexually active, but they realized they were being like sluts before, and like how they learned how they were like damaging their soul. Because a lot of the sensual activities people do, porn, being on dating apps, it feels tingly to the flesh, but you're murdering your soul in the process because you don't know the energies you're tangling with, and everything is energy and everything is spirit. So if you hop in bed with somebody you just met, your soul doesn't know this person, your soul don't like that, even though your dick do, or your asshole, or your mouth, or whatever. But your soul is all you're gonna have left when you depart this plane of existence, no matter what you believe in. If you beat it up with a bunch of sensual, surface level things, then you're gonna be fucked. But when you realize that and you feel ashamed for what you've done, then that shame produces corrective action. Now, this is not self-condemnation or anything like that. This is like, oh, fuck what I've been doing. Let me do better. And so I've been meeting a lot of people who could be being hoes and they're choosing not to. But that's that. It could be any fucking thing that people have been doing that really hasn't been serving them. This shame here, that what this book is talking about, how you were saying somebody else looks at you. No. Like how I was saying earlier, everybody's got enough to figure out within themselves on this journey that rather than be looking over at some motherfucking body else or up at God or wherever thinking that they know better than them. Fuck no, they do not. People in the church who think who like when I was at Lakewood Church and I got fired from volunteering for not being straight, and they fire other people too, even staff members when they find out they're queer. Like the hubris, the low key hubris there is what they're saying is that you all are unfit to serve because of your sin, but we're righteous enough to serve. Okay, they don't hear it as they're being prideful, but they are being prideful, but then they'll come out and preach against pride. That's how sneaky, like, ego and hubris is. It's one of the devil's main tricks because it makes people feel like they're being righteous in their energy, but they're not. Although they damn near feel the same, but they cannot make another person feel ashamed because of their evaluation. Because when people evaluate somebody, they're evaluating somebody through their lens, and somebody's lens may be fractured. This is why I don't give a fuck about what anybody thinks. And I always tell everybody else to not give a fuck about what anybody thinks, because whatever somebody else thinks, it's based on their life history stories, unhealed trauma, and what they think is corrupt. And therefore, nobody should be able to make somebody else feel ashamed because they don't have power or clarity to do that. And so when I look at this book cover, it just reminds me of confusion, like all the squiggly lines. And what it conveys to me is the chaos that comes within people's soul, because the squiggly lines go from this person's waist through their elbows, fingers, all over their heart, of their minds. When people have this abuse, they can't see straight. Their hands are over their eyes, so their vision's blocked. That means they can't see themselves right. They can't see the world right. They can't see where they're going. Their point of view is fucked up. The squiggly lines in the head have to do with that, the confusion in the mind. So there's a disconnect now between the mind and the soul. Poor health in the body, of the way this body looks with all these squiggly lines. This is what this is conveying to me. This is complete dysfunction and disease. Those squiggly lines are giving me incessant movement, anxiety. When people go through things, they tend to, like, a person can fill their schedule with a whole bunch of shit. Not to, it could be hoeing, it could be volunteering, it could be all kinds of things, and not realize they're doing it to spiritual bypass and do emotional bypass rather than actually tend to the issue at hand. So I'm seeing a lot of busy movement here that's not actually producing anything. Those are some of the things that I get when from God, that's when I look at this cover.
This is a divine reading. Is that what we're saying?
So I think the job on the cover is very captivating, very provocative, and it really pulls people in and is letting you know that whatever emotion is about to come through this book is some fucked up shit what done happened. So referencing Lakewood Church, and we'll talk about this will be the last thing before we switch over to the dad jokes. As mentioned earlier, Jerry Falwell Jr. of people who made this Liberty University. So if anybody gets any time on their hands and they want to kind of skip over to Hulu, there's a show on there called God Forbid, the Sex Scandal That Brought Down a Dynasty. We have Jerry Falwell Jr. and his wife, Becky, and that hot ass fucking pool boy, Giancarlo Granda, who, you know, was doing all of their sexual shit because I watched that motherfucking documentary. I sure did. And, all the tea began to be spilled when Jerry Falwell Jr., his photo came out with him and his pants unzipping with some hoe that wasn't his wife. Now, this is the person who wanted to tell everybody else they need to not be queer and all of this, and he running around with his bourbon, always got the goddamn bourbon or scotch in his hand, dick out, dick swinging with bitches that's not even his wife, and they got a pool boy in the mix boning his wife. Okay, that's
It's like the most wild story, right? Because like you can't make this stuff up. You have, like you said, like you have this leader of the world's largest evangelical university who, the university itself is an institution where you can't, for the longest time, I think now you can actually kiss, but for the longest time you couldn't even kiss, right? Like you could hold hands, but there was like a 3-second rule for how long you could hug, and then eventually, and again, you couldn't, have any sexual activity outside of marriage, and yet you had the leader of this institution, the son of the founder, who was cuckolding relationship where his wife was getting fucked by a Miami pool boy, and he was masturbating in the corner watching, like, and then it all comes out, and it's just this whole crazy story where then he throws her under the bus, like Adam and Eve, like the story of Adam and Eve, where he's like, she did it. She takes the fall. She's like, I cheated on him. Jerry didn't do anything. Meanwhile, there's video evidence that he knew that it wasn't just like he was surprised. Like the whole documentary, again, you'll see it and how it ends is just so well. Again, the ending, I think, it's this sort of like banger of an ending. I don't think that the documentary itself I think it could have ended better, but the very footage that they show is this, truth bomb shows, again, video evidence that he knew. So the whole thing is just absolutely bonkers. And you're absolutely right. I think that folks should absolutely watch it. I'm going to stop saying absolutely, but it is a very well, it's quite a story. It's quite a story.
You mentioned how they didn't want you to get married or kiss. Hillsong Church and Hillsong's universe in Australia has archaic, draconic things like this too. And Joel and Victoria Osteen and these Falwells, I'm sure, but for damn sure that Brian Houston and Bobby Houston, because the Houstons and Joel and Victoria Osteen be in photos and shit, even after Brian Houston's child molestation situation with his dad was fucking the boys and he was covering it up, fucking the little 9-year-old boys and covering it up. So what I want to point out to people here is this is how projection works. This is why we can't let anybody shame us because they do not know better than you. And this is why I promote people to get alone with God, to perhaps get away from church being a place of schooling, even if it's not a university, which we should graduate from church in any university because it's school. You cannot be in school forever. Eventually, you're supposed to get away from church and go on with God and learn by yourself with Him. These people will have all these rules and project onto you while they do worse because you don't know people's true mental health and state of mind. Just because somebody in the mind is a very intricate web. I've studied hypnotherapy. I'm a licensed hypnotist. I have been to divination school, divinatory school. I study and practice divination as a magician. And I already have a bachelor's. I have a lot of fucking education. I know how motherfucking people work. And then I've been a drug dealer. And then, like I said, I've been homeless twice. I know humans. And one thing about people is you can't look at a motherfucker and tell if they crazy or not. And the craziest people don't know they're fucking crazy and they don't think that they are. And so it's very logical for the Falwells to have orgies and shit on the weekend and the Houston's probably whatever the fuck they're doing, and tell you not to kiss because it makes them feel good about themselves. And yet the energy is bad and it fucks up people and is very corrupt. A side note, I just want to let people know that marriage, the little document that they try to act like you have to have before you can fuck, don't matter. Because as far as God is concerned, you are married when you have a close enough soul fusion with somebody. Before you traipse down the aisle and hop across the broomstick and all of that ceremony shit, that's just for fluff. If it's legitimate people and it's not some sort of fake ass arrangement marriage, like before you sign that paper, you were already married as far as God is concerned. And I need people to understand that marriage is a spiritual thing. It is not a courthouse documentation thing. So be careful how you deal with being in relationships with people because soul fusion and sex and all of that is a very powerful thing, but it's not to be played with because you'll fuck around and be married to somebody before you think you are. If thinking you need a piece of paper is not true. I suppose, yeah, I mean, I talked about my fucking shit with Joel and Victoria Osteen enough. Just know that these mega churches, just be careful fucking with them. Just do. And really, any church, and just really be sure that your alone time with God is important. But for whatever it's worth, I did serve there for, I don't know, a few years. I volunteered in the kids ministry teaching. I sang in the adult choir, was a worship leader in the kids choir, and I was the volunteer manager as well in the kids department. I was awarded awards in the kids life department and everything. I applied for a job there. And even though years of service to them wasn't enough, they needed to check my MySpace page. The MySpace was still a thing. They needed to go to MySpace to find out who I really am because serving next to them, going there 5 days a week, getting there early, leaving late wasn't enough. They had to ask social media. And they found out I was hanging out in Montrose in the queer part of Houston, and that was just much too much. They came to me when I thought they were about to give me this job and said, "We're actually firing you for volunteering and working for free unless you read these books and become straight. In the meantime, you can be an usher, and then we'll see about working you back up in our good graces." And so I got up and walked the fuck out. I would get my felonies later on as a drug dealer. I wasn't going to get any that day on the campuses of Lakewood Church. But you see, if I would have done that, then I would have fed into the lie. You got plenty of gay people on staff at Lakewood Church, and a lot of them probably have wives. Because there was you have some queens on staff that who have wives there. Trust me, my gaydar is on point. They in the house, and that's every damn where you go. Where you have people, you got gay people. But but if I would have fed into the lie, and they know that too, then I could have read these books, put myself in a state of mind where I'm straight, when got a girl, got her pregnant, and then been in this situation 20 years later where I'm like, you know what? I've been gay this whole time. Sorry. Thanks for the kids though. It, they, because they know that it's all a construct and it's a lie. So as long as you have a wife and you look the fucking part, then they will let you stay, but it's all fake. And so you really have to be careful about getting yourself seeped into these energies. That's all I have to say. The book is called Shame, Sex, Attraction, Survivor Stories of Conversion Therapy by our editor and contributing author, Lucas Frederick William Wilson. Do you have any last words, anything else you want to talk about or say before we get into our daddy jokes?
Oh goodness. I feel like daddy jokes are probably the best way to end. So I will put a cork in it.
Okay. Well, there's something else you could have put in it too, but you decided to flat
Yes. Yes. Decisions. Which these worries.
decisions and options. A cork or a dick? Which will it be? I don't know. I'm feeling quirky.
I feel like quirky. You feel like quirky to say not so cocky. I don't know. I don't know.
I thought they were the same. Today's oh Lord, what would ever happen if we met in person? You know, I've never been to Canada. I might just need to come out there. You in Ontario?
I'm in Toronto. That's where pardon me. I'm from Toronto, and that's where my house is. Yeah, but Montreal is really the best. Montreal is the place that you want to go, not Toronto.
Mm.
Toronto's wonderful, but Montreal is the place.
Oh, do they do a lot of LSD there?
So I don't know. I've never done LSD in Montreal, but I can do some research and get back to you.
Yeah, that's the kind of party girl I am. I like to go out to a very energetically balanced space, drop an insane amount of acid, talk to Jesus, twirl, and get my life with my sunglasses on. I don't drink. I don't do cocaine in the bathroom with the other queens. I'm not judging, but I will drop my fucking tabs and go in there and act like I own the bitch.
You do own the bitch.
I do. All right, so this website is justballgloves.com. Says dad joke number one is, what did the buffalo say as his son left?
Bye, boy. That's not a dad joke, I know. Very wonderful.
Oh. What did the buffalo say after his son left?
Bye. Bye, son. Bye,
Yeah.
sir.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. There you go. I knew you had it in you.
I love it. We should be arrested for this. Yeah.
You know what? Handcuffs are sexy in a way. Just make sure they're furry and pink.
Yeah. Cuff me, boys. I've been down.
But having been to jail a few times, it ain't like the porns. And I don't even watch porn. It's so damn fake anymore. But and the energy is bad. But having been to jail, it ain't nowhere near that fucking attractive. But
They should make it clear to us, because here we are wanting to go get arrested and get put in handcuffs and put into a cell, and yet it turns out that it's not as good as they promised. This is false advertising, ultimately.
no, there's not everybody's walking around in there ready to like pump you full of cum. This just doesn't go that way.
No.
Well,
Contrary to popular opinion.
I'm saying not everybody. There's some shit definitely did pop off, but it's not like it was the going thing. Well, people gonna do what people gonna do. Let me see here. Dad joke number 2. What occurred when the cup of coffee got offended by a joke?
But coffee. Spilled the beans. Actually,
It's already brewed. It's a cup of coffee.
yes. All right. All right, Joe. Coffee. Steamed. I don't know. It was steaming. I don't know when.
A brouhaha.
A good old fashioned brouhaha. Brouhaha. Okay.
Okay, I think you're gonna get dad joke number 3. Why do
Let's
bees
hope.
why do bees like honeybees have sticky hair?
Because they have butterless cats. That doesn't make sense. Bee worker bee.
Their hair. Why would a bee have sticky hair? What do they like fly around in? Like what do they like do?
Vines. They buzz and they fly in cars. I'm getting inspirations. I don't know.
Because they use a honeycomb.
This conversation is over. No, that's good. Cheeky bees.
They use a honeycomb, silly. It's
Duh.
God. Love it. All right, thank you so much, Lucas, for coming on the show and sharing your joy, your pain, your sensitivity, your spirituality, your humor, your handsome fucking sexy ass face with us. And We look forward to releasing this to the world. Congratulations on your book.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for having me.
Thank you all so much for joining us today and for taking some time to invest into yourself and into the lives of your loved ones. Please visit us at sexdrugsandjesus.com and check out our resource page, our spiritual service offerings, my blog, my books, and other writings that God has partnered with me to create. Find us on any social media platform. Stay strong, my people, and just remember that everything is going to be all right.